All right, this is Block 9, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, as we're going to see in another set of notes, gets re-elected in November of 1864, fairly overwhelmingly, and in March of 1865, Lincoln takes the oath of office for the second time. The Civil War is coming to an end. Lee has not yet surrendered to Grant, but the end is less than a month away. And with the end of the war coming, Lincoln sets out kind of his plan for what to do after the war is over. And he proposed a policy of forgiveness and reconciliation with the South. And in the last great speech of his life, which was going to end in about a month, President Lincoln ended his speech with these lines of forgiveness and reconciliation. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. By March of 1865, people are optimistic that the war will be over soon and the nation will be reunited, and that the problems that bedeviled the country were finally, and after an incredible amount of violence, behind it. On April the 9th, 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant, and the Civil War was rapidly coming to a close. And now into the story comes a Southerner, an actor by the name number 3 of John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was a member of the most famous acting family in the United States. His father was a famous actor, his brother was a famous actor, and he was a famous actor. He was considered to be one of the best looking and most talented celebrities in the entire United States. It would almost be as if it were Brad Pitt today doing these things. Booth was also a Southerner and a Confederate sympathizer who hated Abraham Lincoln. And as the war drew to a close, negatively for his particular chosen side, Booth decided to do something drastic to revive the fortunes of the Confederacy. And Booth comes up with this big plan, and his plan at first is to kidnap Lincoln. He wants to kidnap Lincoln and hold him ransom for prisoners, hold him ransom for a peace treaty with the South. But eventually, or very quickly actually, Booth changes his mind. And he changes his mind because the war is ending and there's no chance of a prisoner exchange. Lee is about to surrender, Richmond has fallen, and Booth realizes that there's really no hope for a military victory any longer. Also, Booth had attended a speech by Lincoln in which the president had supported full voting rights for ex-slaves, and that was too much for Booth. Booth said, this cannot go on. He said something to the effect of, the niggers are going to be citizens and we need to do something about that. So Booth decides, he changes his plan from a plan of kidnapping to one of assassination. Booth's conspiracy. It's not just John Wilkes Booth involved in the shooting of Abraham Lincoln. He had partners from his kidnapping scheme, and he took those partners in the kidnapping scheme and he made them partners in the assassination scheme. And he changed the plan to assassinate not only Lincoln, but all of the North's major leaders. Booth knew that Lincoln liked to go to the theater, and he knew that he enjoyed going with General Grant. So Booth's plan was he would kill both Lincoln and Grant, who were to attend the theater that night. Lincoln would be killed by a single-shot derringer, Grant would be killed with a knife. His partner, George Atzerodt, would kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at his official residence, and a conspirator by the name of Lewis Powell would kill Secretary of State William Seward at his home. Then, with other people involved in the conspiracy, they would run and escape down to the South. So Booth plots and plans as Lincoln begins to celebrate the end of the war that he has done so much to bring about in a positive way for the United States. 3 nights before his assassination, on the night that Lee surrendered to Grant, Lincoln had a dream. And according to Ward Hill Lamon, his friend and biographer, Lincoln told his friend about his dream, and he told some other people. And he said this is how his friend related, how Lincoln told him. "About 10 days ago I retired very late," Lincoln said. "I had been up waiting for important dispatches from the front. I could not have been in bed long when I fell into a slumber, for I was weary. I soon began to dream. There seemed to be a death-like stillness about me. Then I heard subdued sobs, as if a number of people were weeping. I thought I left my bed and wandered downstairs. There the silence was broken by the same pitiful sobbing, but the mourners were invisible. I went from room to room. No living person was in sight, but the same mournful sounds of distress met me as I passed along. I saw light in all the rooms. Every object was familiar to me, but where were all the people who were grieving as if their hearts would break? I was puzzled and alarmed. What could be the meaning of all this? Determined to find the cause of a state of things so mysterious and so shocking, I kept on until I arrived in the east room, which I entered. There I met with a sickening surprise. Before me was a catafalque, on which rested a corpse wrapped in funeral vestments. Around it were stationed soldiers who were acting as guards, and there was a throng of people gazing mournfully upon the corpse, whose face was covered, others weeping pitifully. "Who is dead in the White House?" I demanded of one of the soldiers. "The President," was his answer. "He was killed by an assassin." Then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which woke me from my dream. I slept no more that night, and although it was only a dream, I have been strangely annoyed by it ever since. On the evening of April the 14th, 1865, Lincoln and his wife went to Ford's Theater in Washington to see a play called Our American Cousin. It was a British comedy of manners that was the most popular thing in the United States and England at the time. General Grant did not come along because General Grant's wife did not get along with Mary Todd Lincoln. So the Lincolns kind of had to invite some other people until they could find somebody without plans. And they found a man by the name of Major Rathbone and his wife, who was a senator's daughter. And so Major Rathbone and his wife accompanied the President and Mrs. Lincoln. Lincoln went up to the President's box. It was a full house that night. He was holding Mary's hand. Mary giggled and asked him what the young Major Rathbone would think of them holding hands, and Lincoln replied to her, "I don't think he'll think anything of it." And those would be Lincoln's last words. Lincoln's bodyguard had excused himself and was across the street at a tavern drinking with Lincoln's driver and his footman and his coachman. But honestly, we can castigate Lincoln's bodyguard. It probably wouldn't have mattered. Everyone would have recognized John Wilkes Booth, and someone would have the bodyguard would have said, "Oh, here's a celebrity using his celebrity to come and say hi to the President." Booth crept up outside of the President's box where he had cut a tiny little peephole earlier in the day, and he peered in. Booth, being an actor, knew the play by heart, and he waited for a line that he knew would make the audience laugh. That was when he was going to pull the trigger so that the gunshot would not be heard. The line was delivered. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man-trap." Well, at that line, that was apparently the funniest line in the entire play. Don't ask me why, I don't know. The entire audience started cracking up, laughing out loud. And at that point, Booth opened the door, crept forward, put his pistol on the back of President Lincoln's head, right behind his left ear, and pulled the trigger. Lincoln immediately slumped forward in his rocking chair, mortally wounded. Mary reached out, caught him, realized that she was covered in blood, and screamed. Upon hearing the gunshot, Major Rathbone, who had seen combat before, jumped from his seat and tried to prevent Booth from escaping. Booth drew his knife that he intended to kill Grant with and stabbed the Major violently in the arm. And then Booth vaulted over the rail of the box onto the stage below. It was about 12 feet. In the process, his riding spur got caught on a flag, and he landed awkwardly on his left foot, breaking his leg. No one knew what was going on. All they knew was a very popular actor all of a sudden had jumped onto stage, and Booth played this up. He made the audience believe that this was somehow part of the play. No one recognized what was going on. It was chaos, and it only took a few seconds. He held the bloody knife up over his head and yelled, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is the Virginia state motto, which means "thus always to tyrants." Booth was already out the door towards his horse when people realized that this was not part of the play, and he escaped on horseback. The rest of the conspiracy was not nearly as successful as Booth's part. Atzerodt went to a bar to work up a little bit of Dutch courage in order to kill Vice President Johnson, but didn't really stop drinking, got drunk, and never attacked the Vice President. Lewis Powell did attack Secretary of State Seward in his home and badly wounded him, but was fought off by a combination of Seward and Seward's son. Back at Ford's Theater, the situation was grim. People realized what had happened. People had yelled out, "The president has been shot. Is there a doctor in the house?" A young Army doctor by the name of Leal, Dr. Leal, took charge immediately of Lincoln, examined the body, cut his shirt collar, realized that the president was bleeding from a wound in the head, pronounced it, and declared he had seen plenty of combat in his life, and Dr. Leal announced very quickly that the wound was mortal. Shortly thereafter, the chief surgeon of the Army arrived and sadly agreed with Dr. Leal's assessment. They did not want to allow Lincoln to die in a theater, so they said, "Where can we bring him?" They were not going to carry him back to the White House. It was too far, a bumpy carriage. Lincoln was still breathing. Dr. Leal realized that the blood in his brain was clotting where the wound had opened up, and if he stuck his fingers into Lincoln's brain to relieve the clot, Lincoln breathed much more easily. So all night, Dr. Leal sat by Lincoln's head, sticking his finger into his brain to relieve the pressure so the president could breathe more easily. A trip to the White House across the bumpy roads was not practicable, and they did not want to bring him into a tavern across the street. They realized that having the president die in a tavern was no way for the president to die. So he was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he was placed on the nicest bed that was available. Unfortunately, the president was so tall that they had to stick him diagonally across the bed. Word spread throughout Washington that the president had been mortally wounded. Crowds began to appear and gather at this house across the street from Ford's Theater, including Secretary of War Edward Stanton, who kind of took control of the government for the night. Mary Todd Lincoln, her dress still covered in her husband's blood, broke down and had to be escorted from the room. She kept talking to her husband, begging him to wake up and to talk to her. And when he didn't, she snapped. She broke down and had to be escorted from the room. Lincoln survived all night, but as morning came, his body slowly gave up the fight. It was an unfair fight. Lincoln was brain dead from the moment the bullet entered his skull. At 7:22 in the morning on April the 15th, 1865, Lincoln's breathing slowed and finally stopped. Secretary of War Stanton announced to the room that the president was dead and then delivered a line. And Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the..." And nobody knew exactly what he said next. He either said ages, "Now he belongs to the ages," which makes sense, or "Now he belongs to the angels," which also makes sense. And we're not really sure. Different witnesses wrote it down both ways that night. So either line would be appropriate. Now he belongs to the ages, now he belongs to the angels. Lincoln was dead at the age of 56. John Wilkes Booth was hunted down in a manhunt the likes of which the nation had never seen before and would never see since. Unable to move quickly because of his broken leg, Booth was tracked down by the Union Army cavalry to a barn in Virginia. He refused to come out alive, and Union troops set fire to the barn, and as Booth tried to escape out the back, he was shot, and he was hit in the back, up near the neck, and was paralyzed. It severed his spinal cord. And then he was kind of given succor and comfort by the Union Army as he was dying. He asked for some water. They gave him a little bit of water. And then he asked, as he was dying, to see his hands, that he could no longer move because he was paralyzed. And they showed Booth his hands, and as he died, he looked at them and he said, "Useless, useless." And Booth died. The rest of the conspirators were hunted down and hanged or given long prison sentences, including people who may not have even known much about the conspiracy, that the mood in the country was such that if you were assumed to be a part of the conspiracy, you were assumed to be guilty. The country, number 10, was now in the hands of President Andrew Johnson, a nearly illiterate Democrat. He didn't know how to read and write and do basic math until he was 18 years old and his wife taught him. And he was never much for education even after that. He was not even a Republican. He was a Democrat that Lincoln had chosen as a running mate to kind of put on a show that the country was united. And now, the awesome task of reuniting the country was not in the capable and wonderful hands of Abraham Lincoln. They were in the hands of President Andrew Johnson, and that would have far-reaching consequences for the history of the United States. Lincoln's funeral train took his body back to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, on a long circuitous route throughout the Union, where people lined up by the hundreds of thousands to pay their last respects to a person who was not very popular when he became president, but by the time he died, had been recognized for all he had done to save his country. He is the greatest president in American history, I think, by far. That no president has ever had to deal with the problems that Abraham Lincoln had to deal with. And this man, not formally educated, self-taught, from a common family, from a poor family, born in a log cabin, raised as a farmer, proved to the world that a country where a common person could rise to the best of their abilities could be the savior of a country. And by the time Lincoln was killed, they were not calling him all of the names that they had called him when he became president. They were calling him Father Abraham and Old Honest Abe. And he would be sorely missed. America has not seen the likes of him since, because the likes of him are not often seen in the world.